The Tim Heale Podcasts. Ordinary people's extraordinary stories.
Welcome to the Tim Heale Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to have a chat with Jonathan. Jonathan's going to tell us all about his life. So, Jonathan, if you can tell me when and where you were born, and if you can describe what it was like where you grew up, the schools you went to, and the education that you received. So, you're on board.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me here.
You're welcome. So let's get into it.
Okay. All right. Start at the beginning, right? So
Absolutely.
I was born in 1966, and now it seems like a long time ago because every time you have to put your birth date in, right? You scroll on the websites. It's like, oh my goodness, This is a long time ago. And
well, there's two things there. 1966, for some reason, England won the World Cup. And talking about scrolling through, I mean, I was born on the 5th of the 4th, 1758. So you've got to go all the way back to 1758 before you get to, I mean, it's a lot more scrolling. People don't believe me when I say I'm 264.
You seem so young.
I know. I don't look a day over 263.
So I was born in 1966. And my parents, my father was born in Michigan, the state of Michigan, and my mother in the state of California. And what is unusual about that is that they were both, when I was born, I don't know, my dad was very early 20s. So was my mom. So they got married young. They met each other in college. But what was unusual about their particular cases, they both wanted to become Christian missionaries overseas. And originally, as they tell me, they were planning on going to Africa. And last minute, with the Christian organizations they were with, because of one of the many civil wars that they have in that part of the world, they got redirected last minute to France. And this was in 1966. And they wound up there, and they lived in the Paris area for years. Were in the French Protestant church, and they found a new love for a new people group, a new identity. And so these are young Americans in the 1960s. And now that I'm older, when you look back on some of the things, like, oh my goodness, they were young. And I saw some of the pictures when I was just a baby, and the area around there just looked. It's not like today where there's a lot of tourism. Back in those days, there were hardly no Americans, especially later on when they went from Paris to southern France, and that part, it looked like a third world country, to be honest. My parents were like, there was no.
That's probably why they needed missionaries there.
Yeah. But you could still tell the effect of post-World War II. And people didn't normally, like compared to the United States at that point in time, people had refrigerators, they had telephones, they had all the modern amenities. And you can see that in the sitcoms, in the old sitcoms. Yeah. And in France, those things were pretty rare. In fact, when I was still in my teens, I still remember villages and areas where by modern standards are still very primitive. A lot of that's changed now. So
not much of it has, actually. You still go through some of the villages in France, and they still look as though they're in the early 1900s.
Well, now there's some of that fake look where there's so many tourists coming in now that the southern France looks more southern France than it really did. And I think it's like that all around the world. Switzerland looks more like Switzerland than it really did. It's mainly a drive by the tourist to demand. Now I think in the old villages where I grew up, when I go back now, and it's all these cute lampposts and stuff, I'm like, none of this stuff existed. Those villages never looked like that. They look awesome right now. I mean, everything's manicured, but the people were too poor back then to have that. So it's a little bit of a projection when you go back in time in some of these places, and it wasn't as pretty and as nice as people make it out to be. But of course, when it's the place you grow up in, there's a lot of love and charm for for the culture and the people because you're enmeshed in it. But just the
Yeah.
outward external view of it, a lot of times I smile. It's like, no, it didn't really look like that.
So you kind of grew up in France then?
I grew up in France and I went through the French public school system. So as far as the average person was concerned, I was a French. They had no idea that I actually was an American. My parents were American, so the only place I spoke English was in the home with my parents. We didn't even have other American people around us. We had the occasional odd British person in a village in France, which has been a staple for, I don't know, centuries. But even then, that was pretty rare back then. Now, when I go back, I bump into English speaking people all the time if I go back and visit. But back in those days, it was just me and my parents. And so I had.
So that's kind of interesting. If you were speaking English at home and then having to go to school and now having to speak French all the time.
Yeah.
So how did you learn the French in the first place?
Well, when my parents went
did-
over, I was 2 years old. So I just grew up speaking it. I was bilingual from the get-go. So I guess I learned it at the same time. And so my English was something I had in the home, and my father had a huge personal library. So I kind of had a dual education, just where I just enjoyed reading from my father's personal library, but the rest of my life was conducted in French. And so even living in France, you're always, and you hear this obviously from many other people who grow in other cultures, you
Yeah.
really are always seeing things from a sort of
Blinker
yeah, just
perspective.
two different perspectives all the
Yeah.
time. So
That's fascinating then. So what was the first school you went to like?
the earliest memories I have were in a French public school in the Paris area. And I still remember, and this is one of the things I liked about France, especially when I look back, is they like things to be very orderly in their educational system. Sometimes, at least in those days, to the point of being too rigid. But I do remember them taking great pride in neat handwriting and journals that are very well kept. And so there's a certain amount of pleasure that you pick up in learning things, because it's a slow pace as compared to now, where I live now in the United States. Comparing other people's educational experiences here in the United States, there's a great emphasis on having always feeling happy and having fun. So when you do educational stuff, it's much more of you don't sit in it. You don't take the pleasure of just learning, holding a book in your hands. Whereas in France, I do remember having that pleasure where they let you sit and read and write, and in the general sense of the way they do things. And so those are some of those things that I've taken with me throughout my life, and have been able to share some of that with my own children.
So I'm not quite sure what the school system is in France. So you've obviously gone through sort of maybe kindergarten and then sort of junior
Yeah, and I went
route
all the way.
school.
I went through the whole educational system in the public schools. What they also have a pretty strong private school system in France. It's very different than it is in the United States. I'm not exactly sure how it works in England. Germany, I know, is very different than France. So I don't know of other how that works in the other countries, though. The French public school system is a very bureaucratic minded school, way more than the United States is. And so what their goal is, they have these bizarre, we consider bizarre from the outside, they just think it's normal, but their goal is to only graduate a minimum number of students possible from high school, which is the complete opposite goal in the United States. They want everybody to graduate. So even if you can't read, you can't do anything, you're still going to get your diploma and out your door. In France, it's the reverse. Actually, it's a screening system, so it's very much of an elitist mentality, and so they only want, let's say, the top 50%, I don't know what the numbers are, but around that
Mm.
number to go on to a university education and so forth, because part of the problem is they have so many social promises they make to the people that they can't deliver on. So one way to solve that problem is to fail people. So they're very much they're very failure minded people. So they expect you to fail. And what happens in order to counter that is, I remember being a young teen, is that your friends will say, "Hey, are you going to be there next year in such and such a grade?" And it's like, "No, my parents have decided to flunk me." So there's an interesting concept. This is unheard of here. You flunk your children because if you go too far down the educational path, you can't come back. You can't go in and out. Let's say in the 11th grade, you say, "You know what? I have a real love for math. I really want to go down that road." Well, too bad. You should have made that decision 3 years ago. You can't get back into these very rigid educational tracks, which again is a very different concept. So what the parents would do is work it with the teacher to get to flunk. And looking back on it, I'm not, when you're a child, you don't really process that.
Yeah.
I don't know how those conversations work, but it happened all the time. So that's what the main goal of the private schools were, is you'd have these private schools dotted all over the landscape, and some would specialize in science, some would specialize in math. So these were intended or literary or emphasis. And what they'd basically do is they would double down on the tutoring and so forth, and the parents would pay out of pocket with a combination of state scholarships. And then when they would get back up to that proficiency level for the particular educational track, they would come back into the public. So this is going in and out. And this does not exist in the United States, even as I'm telling you this out loud. It's hard for people to compute. But over there in that culture, that's how they work things. So
I mean, so there is some justification in what the English tend to call the French. Then,
yeah,
cheesy eating surrender monkeys.
Yeah, they do take pride in some of their scholarship, but there's a bizarre marriage with bureaucracy. So you get so even if you were, let's say, very good out, visibly, objectively, by any standard, you were very, very good independently. If you're not inside these very rigid bureaucratic paths, it's very hard for you to get back in. And or even out for that matter. I mean, you can always fail by getting out, but it's not an easy. Where here the mentality is everyone can go forward, sometimes to an exaggerated attitude, but still, if later on in life you say, "Hey, I think I really want to get into this," as long as you can objectively prove that you have the stamina and the proficiency, you can more or less get back in. There's always a way. There's no stigma. Whereas over there, starting probably around age 14, or maybe even earlier than that, you are really starting to be pegged along certain tracks. And so that's something I have had very intimate knowledge with that did not affect me. And because at the end of the day, and I process this now as an adult, I was still an American. So at some point in time, this wasn't really discussed in the household. But the implication was that at some point in time, I would come back to the United States, at which point all those tracks and grades and certifications mean absolutely nothing once you go into another culture. They just stare at you blankly. So that is something that you learn, and this will come later on in our conversation, is that a lot of times what you think is so important
just
isn't at the end of the day, because once you go into another culture, you realize you can't even argue with it, because they have no way to even wrap their minds around it. So you're just like, oh, I guess it really wasn't all that important after all.
So I mean, it kind of explains quite a lot about the French psyche, in why the French tend to be so militant when it comes to demonstrating, and they'll go out on strike at the drop of a hat.
Yes.
And protest. I mean, they're world renowned for protesting.
And that's part of their the way they make change in general, and they will tell you that they are self-aware enough, especially if they've traveled, that they will admit that it's a kind of unique French way of dealing with change. They come up with the most ludicrous laws and bureaucracies, and they will vote for it. But if you get each individual person, you'll find it. Whereas here in the United States, people tend to be very militant in their beliefs, clearly, but they tend to be consistent. So in other words, if they vote for something, then they believe in it, right or wrong. They actually believe it. Whereas in France, you have a lot of times people will tell you they voted for something, but they don't really. They'll tell you, but I don't really believe in it. So you're like, what? Huh? This is very hard to compute. And in their mind, it is a very Latin attitude. They always, when they say, but we're not as bad as, and they will point to the Italians or the Spanish, the Corsicans. They're worse. So they'll have all these laws. I mean, they have it's the proverbial one-way street sign, right? They'll come up with all the one-way street signs. They're all aboard on this in the village, but then each one of them will enthusiastically break the very law that they're all excited about. So in fact, here's a funny story. When I go back, they have roundabouts, what we call roundabouts, or in French they call them round points. And the French will laugh, because I remember as a child how stressful it was to go through these intersections, because the French get very aggressive in their driving. Not everyone, but a significant portion of them, and they will tell you they do. So I'm not criticizing them in a way they wouldn't. They finally came up, especially in the village, with these roundabouts, because now everyone's a winner. No one has to slow down, right? So you go in there, and they go round and round. And I don't know if statistically it has solved the problem, but they would tell you that there are fewer accidents, because they'll tell you with a big grin that the French, meaning themselves, can't abide red lights, green lights. They know it should be, but they have them in abundance. They just don't like to.
They just don't use them.
They just don't. So now they have roundabouts, which is a kind of annoying now, because it does slow you down. So every little village, every obscure area has these roundabouts. And I will say, and I haven't been back very often in the last few years, but I will say it is less stressful driving, because when you get to these intersections, you instinctively you start tensing up, and you start looking, because on the other side, as long as the game is, if you don't make eye contact, you go for it, right? And I grew up in villages, so it could be that in the big cities it's not as bad, but definitely where I grew up, that was very much anything that is government regulated or rules. They love making them, which is interesting. They love them. They've got an agency for everything, but they also just as much love not
to break them.
Love to break them.
So let's have a little bit of look at some of the subjects you did in school, because I'm quite interested in history and how it's taught, and particularly French history and how they teach that. Because they had a little rut a while back where they turfed out the gentry, and they had the thing called a guillotine, and cut off their heads and bits and pieces like that, and became a republic. Now, they probably kind of regret that when they see how great we have a queen. So they've got the revolution, then they've got what happened in the First and Second World Wars. How was that taught in France?
Well, I guess I didn't finish the thought, and I'll finish the previous thought we had, because this is going to tie in directly to it. When they do change over there, they tend to, once they go down a particular road, they don't take advice. They don't take public advice very well. And in that sense, it's very elite, what we would call elitist. And so things will at some point come to a boil, where everybody is mad, including even people inside the bureaucracy, but they can't get off. They have it built with their customs and their laws where it just explodes. Whereas some countries tend to have much more of a consensus-oriented building, where yes, they have the laws and so forth, but you get this gradual nibbling at the sides. Like, in the U.S., people don't always like the speed limit laws, and they've been gradually raised. But it's also well known that in the bigger cities, people tend to go at least 10 miles over the speed limit, and the police officers don't enforce it. So that's what I would call that gradual pushing against the boundaries. And between the police officers and the judges, as long as you don't go beyond, it's kind of this and then
Kind of
eventually the
unwritten
laws
rule.
get changed. Yeah,
Yeah.
whereas in France it tends to be very rigid. And so when they want change, it has to come to some kind of like overturning the buses and burning, and then they make this huge dramatic change, but they're so used to thinking like that. And I think, like with the French Revolution, the way it's typically taught, when there are no foreigners around, and the way they teach it officially, at least that I remember in history class, and just the way people look at it, I think looking back on it, they feel guilty about the bloodshed that happened. But at the same time, they also feel like the age of kings had to come to an end. And so they're in their general mindset, especially in the villages, at least in our country, United States, this doesn't exist, but there's history everywhere. There's a building. The new bridge is actually built like 600 years ago. It's still called the New Bridge.
Yeah.
And so everybody's aware in one shape or another, and the institutions have some kind of tie to the past. So they're always much more aware of the past. And I think that in their mind, the general consensus is that the nobility, the legal system, they're not really mad about the nobility, but I think their sense was that everything was corrupt. Like you could buy everything off. Nothing was stable. And they particularly viewed their nobility as sort of what we'd call, in the news, you have all these celebrities, right? When they make it big, and then eventually all their personal sordid life stories come out. They're just, okay. All right. They're on drugs. They're on this. They're on that. They're onto the fifth wife. And that's how they viewed their nobility. They viewed them as kind of like the end of an age where it seemed like in my area, the Marquis de Sade, who's now
Marquis de Sade. Yeah.
Is a typical example. His castle's still there in the area, but everybody that's how they viewed that these people had so much money that they were just into sadomasochistic stuff. They were into just weird stuff. And the French in general kind of would tend to believe that, because I think there is some of that stuff going on. And so they see it as the culture exploded with not instead of having a gradual change, that the guillotine in their mind was the answer. And so I think that's how they see change. They don't want change that way, but that's how they feel change happens, I guess. They feel a lot of guilt. It's like they shouldn't have killed so many people, so they view it as some kind of necessary chaos that they had to go through to get to where they are. Maybe that's the best way to put that. So, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a different way of looking at history to the way that we have it over here.
Yeah, they just whereas as far as in the United States is concerned, when we talk about our history, there's definitely much more of a sense of continuity. There's change, but there's not this hard break in people's minds. It's more of a there's a continuity. Whereas in France, I think things are seen as they see the past, they see the history, but in their mind, the continuity happens when somebody gets their head chopped off, and then at that point you have a new start. Whereas usually at least in the United States, there's this sort of gradual tension and so forth, and then eventually there's a change, but it's not an outright a true revolution.
Yeah. So moving on then. So you kind of got to the end of school there. Then did you
Then I
move
went to
to?
boarding school. My parents thought it was time for me to become more Americanized, to eventually be able to come back into an English speaking world, which was a good idea actually. And they sent me to a boarding school that was explicitly overtly Christian in its ethics and teaching, and this was in Germany near Switzerland.
All right.
And I did the last 3 years of high school there, which was a fantastic experience for me. I had a very good education, made lots of friends with other Americans and Canadians and other English speakers from different countries, whose parents were typically living in some kind in a country other than their own. And so that was the commonality among other things. And it was a wonderful experience. We were located in an area that was surrounded by small little German villages and towns, which is part of the idea when you want to put a boarding school. You don't want it in a city.
No.
For the obvious teenage temptations. And it makes it easier. I still have many, many fond memories. One among many, I just remember a friend who was British, but grew up in Spain, and he spoke, I don't know, 4 or 5 languages. But I remember still to this day where we would go off together talking about whatever topic we had on our minds, and we would go for walks in the surrounding woods, and then come out in the small orchards. It was a beautiful part of the Germany, and it was just the kind of educational environment that's almost idyllic, like you would have in a movie, minus the ubiquitous movie shots, where somebody's getting murdered or the staff are taking advantage of the kids. None of that happened. It was really nice. It was very nice. Brilliant experience. And of course, then at that point, everything was in English, but all the fellow students were kind of the same stage. We all spoke English more or less at varying degrees, but you'd hear several languages spoken in the hallway, or of course made up in boarding schools. You do that. You have this half English, half whatever other language you speak. You make it up, and so yeah, those were good memories, and that's where I got an American/Canadian high school education, which eventually allowed me to, when I came to the United States for college or university, I was able to totally fit in without any difficulty.
So when did you move back to the States then?
I was 17 and a half, and I came back for university, and I wound up in California, where my mother was from originally, in the San Francisco Bay Area, not in San Francisco, but in one of the smaller outlying towns near the low-lying mountains here. And that was the 1980s, at a time when it was known as Silicon Valley. The place was just booming. People were coming from all over the world. The computer industry was really starting to take off. There was work. People were happy. Life was good. And that's where I went to college. So I stayed with my grandmother. The contact was my grandmother, and I rented a room from her in her house.
So what did you major in?
I majored in economic theory.
All right.
Yeah, which looking back on it was not very useful, but I enjoyed it.
Brilliant. So how long did you do in college then? 3 years, did you say?
Yeah, the typical time, 3 to 4 years. And then I came back, I think, to Europe for a year, worked here, taught as an English teacher in a French public school. And then went back to do 2 more years for a master's degree, also in economics, at the same school. So this is all in the San Jose San Francisco area. I don't know if your listeners are that familiar. Most people, when they say where they're from the Bay Area, are really not from San Francisco at all. So all the economic activity is really happening outside of San Francisco, in my opinion. It's in the nicer looking suburban environments. That's where all the economic activity is really happening. So
So what did you do after college then?
and then after college,
you've gone back and come. So when
and
you
after
finally
college,
finished,
I worked. I did some various interesting things, but then I started working for a place that helped troubled youth, and that is kind of the beginning. So you get encouraged by the people around you to pursue activities that don't always make sense for you personally in the long run. Not that these activities are bad or inappropriate, but they don't make sense in the larger scheme of things. So people have ideas, because I come from a background where a lot of people were involved in volunteer type organizations, or if they weren't 100% volunteer, they were near 100% volunteer. But it makes it difficult later on if you want to have a family to continue down that road. And so if you start too soon in those areas, a lot of times you can wind up in a very difficult spot, because you just want to get married and have a family, but you have no money, no experience in the area of making money. And I see this a lot even today, where people in university will major in these degrees that sound very heroic, but at the end of the day, it's like, well, what's your plan? I mean, by definition, you're going to be involved in this activity where you can't put food on the table. So if you're gonna put food on the table, what's your plan? So it's not that you don't necessarily have to get involved, right? But you don't want to wind up it looks good in the movies. Somebody's devoted their life to helping let's say a drug addicts. That's great. You're helping the drug addicts, but how
you putting
but
food
the drug
on the
addicts
table.
are living in your bedroom and you want to get married and there's no money, and how is that going to work out? So people can burn out, not understand that dynamic between being able to give and help people, and at the same time build up a means of livelihood at the end of the day. So my particular background, which I had an amazing childhood, to be honest. And my parents were wonderful parents, and they're still alive, and I love them. And they're very, very giving people. And I knew a lot of other people like that bent over backwards. But if you don't have an independent source of income for young men, it can be difficult to continue down that road. And so I got involved in helping troubled youth and so forth, but it notoriously pays very little money, and it doesn't set you up to then have a career where you can support a family. So I ran into that, and at that time the tech boom was taking off. This was just pre 2000. And we decided, my wife, I was just newly married, and we realized this was a dead end. So we moved to another part of the States, to Colorado Springs. At that point in time, Colorado Springs was starting to really take off as a
tech boom, was it?
Yeah, a tech boom. It was affecting. And so I got high. I didn't really have any, I mean, I had normal computer skills like everybody was starting to have then, just to get your job done, accounting done, so forth. But I really didn't have a focus or even a particular desire. But it so happened that one of the small .com companies, as they called them back then, needed a bilingual French-English person in order to do more marketing and customer support for their French-speaking customers. and they decided that it was easier to find someone who was already bilingual and train them in their tech stuff than to take one of their technicians and make them bilingual.
Yep. I guess that's
So
the
that's what
easier
they
way,
did, and
isn't it?
actually I enjoyed it. That was
Mm.
fun, and for the first time I felt like I'm getting real money and I'm being paid to speak another language that I speak fluently.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was being hired, I had that sort of the imposter syndrome, where after the interview, I could tell the people were like, really, it's like they wanted to hire me. I was like, this can't be real, because elsewhere I had knocked on, no one wants, what do you do with what do you do with skills where you're helping troubled youth? It's like, okay.
Yeah.
So they wanted to hire me the next day, and they paused dramatically, and it's like, well, there is one glitch with this job, and I'm like, okay, here it comes. They said you're going to have to come in really early in order to meet the time demands of this other country, and I think I had to be in by 5 a.m. I can't remember now what time. It was pretty early,
Yeah.
but I got to have this magnificent view that normally executives get of the mountains just right in Colorado Springs. There's a big mountain there where the sun comes in. It was just magnificent. I mean, I think it was one of the happiest times career-wise that I remember, because I got in early before everybody else did. I still got to see everybody. Everybody looked up to me because I spoke another language fluently. Everybody was willing to help train me. Money was flowing in those days. I mean, there was money flowing. I don't know how. Eventually, that place, which I left to go on to move, work with another tech company, did go belly up, like many of them did.
Yeah.
But the money was flowing then, and so we kind of ride that wave, and that allowed me to get out of the philanthropic volunteer work environment that I needed to get out of in order to support a family. And so that was a wonderful experience at that time. And since then, I have never been able to find or bump into a job where French was required. So before other young people are listening to this, French is not very much an international language anymore.
No.
So even
English
the French
is
don't
the
want to speak
national
French.
language of the world. Yeah. And as much as Macron wants the EU to speak French, they're not going to.
Yeah.
English is too well established, so they can do one.
Yeah.
So what did you move on to then?
Well, and then I worked for a large computer company, which, make a long story short, in those days, computer companies merged and bought each other out. And so eventually the company I was with became part of what they called Hewlett Packard, or HP for short now. And it was one of those octopus tech companies that was buying and merging with everybody else. And there's so many different names, and it's not even worth trying to keep track of it all. And that also was actually a great experience. The training that I received was in the heady days before it went down. A lot of other young men, and I enjoyed that. I did. But in that course of that, my wife and I decided that we wanted to homeschool, which is easy to do in the United States, at least from a legal perspective. And so we took advantage of that. I didn't have a personal memory of childhood in the United States because I didn't grow up here, even though I was an American. And so it was easy for me to say we're going to do things differently in my mind, because I grew up in another culture where, they did things, and I wasn't. I think by then I was unimpressed that within each educational system, and this included the boarding school I went to, the teachers were not necessarily international like the students were. So in other words, most of them were taken on because they were explicitly American or Canadian. So when they came over, they only had that perspective on the educational system. And I remember a lot of times, as teenagers also balking at the work that you have to do. It's quick to find out any weakness. And I have teenagers now, so they were very good at that, right? As children, to point out any discrepancies or weaknesses. And it's like, why is this so important? Because you just came from another educational system where maybe they had the opposite view on it, right? And so you realize that a lot of times it's just busy work. I mean, at the end of the day, you'll the French memorize memorize the name of all the kings, so to speak. And they do more than that. I don't want to exaggerate that, but it seems so important.
Yeah.
And you go to another culture and you're like, whatever, everybody's a King Louis. That's good enough. And you realize after a while, you realize you can't even bring this up in conversation. So what's the point? And then, the name of the rivers that seem so important, where you spend so much time being graded and memorizing hour after hour, unless you stay geographically in that very same area, becomes singularly unimportant as soon as you move. And you're just like, well, why spend so much energy studying or memorizing this stuff? And at the end of the day, and even as parents, you become aware some of it is that's what you're doing. You're filling up. What else would these kids do, right? You're like, whatever.
Yeah.
Let them memorize all the tributaries of this particular part of this obscure part of the country. Because what else are you going to do? Are you really going to have them write their thoughts and essays? No, they don't have much to say. So, okay, kids, we're going to spend the next, few months memorizing whatever trivia knowledge. Now, they will always argue, each educational system, well, yes, it's true. Some of it's trivia, but it's the principles we're teaching you. But you know what? As the years go by, it's like, no, I don't even buy that. I think there are some principles you can learn, but most of the time, Tim, I don't know if you've ever done that, where you watch a great documentary or historical analysis on some channel, and in 6 videos, you're thinking, oh my goodness, this is way better than all the years of history that I had in college on this particular topic. And you're like, it could have been done in 1 or 2, 3, and you don't forget that.
Yeah.
And you're like,
wasted all that time.
All that time. And I think that's exactly what it is. The teachers, if they're a little more honest, my wife was a school teacher and before we got married and right in the beginning. And she says, yeah, honestly, that's what it is. Maybe you have 20 students in your classroom and you have the list of approved literature books you need to read, right? But the reality is you have 3 or 4 that are very advanced and they're actually tuning out because it's too easy for them. Some of them in there can barely even read. So they're just, and then the middle ones are just sort of plagiarizing as much as they can. And you as a teacher are trying to engage the students. Well, how much time do you have, right? So you tend to avoid the type of analysis.
Take the easy route.
Right. That makes that looks good on TV. It's like, but the reality is most students are not in that zone, but you still want them to learn. So I don't want to be completely cynical. So really what you're putting out is always seems like a mediocre average. You can never really dig in deep because either you lose, 2/3 behind you in the classroom, or the ones up front are sailing and then you're really losing where they're not gaining anything. So there's that constant what's the statistical term they use? That it's a regression to the mean. So you can't let people get too good and you can't let people too bad. So you have this regression to the mean. At least that's your goal. I don't know if it's actually achievable, but that's kind of what your goal is. So you choose stuff, and that over the years has really influenced my thinking with regards to schooling with my own children. And so
that's what you did. You brought up your own kids and homeschooled them. And how did they do?
They did great. They did really great. And I think that around when my son was 12, at that point in time, I still was working for a large corporation, and I had the privilege back in those days even to work from home. So when I would take a little break, my son came in. He was around 12 at that time, and he's 24 now. So that's more than a decade ago. And in our local libraries, we could go and pick up books. And typically, at that point in time, we would also reserve them online. You could already do that then. And I told my son, "Hey, you haven't read Sherlock Holmes yet? Those are fun to read. You got to read them." And I said, "Go ahead." I said, "Go ahead and reserve them, and we'll pick them up next time we're there." So I'm gonna go make a coffee. So came back with my cup of coffee. My son says, "Okay, I got them all." I said, "Great, we'll pick them all up. You'll enjoy them." He's like, "No, Dad, I have them all literally right here on my Kindle." And it took me. I mean, I knew you could do this. The Kindle revolution hadn't really started as far as like the ebooks and stuff. And make a long story short, I think within a week or 2 weeks, he had read all the Sherlock Holmes, and I knew then this was a game changer. I think it was and I realized we're screaming through the official literature
that they're supposed to be learning at school.
So I'm like, okay, now we're going to bump in to the kind of stupid literature. I'm more bold now that we did in university, right? And I'll be a little bit harsh about that because there's just a lot of people who are teaching who've got a lot of problems in their heads. And when they get to the university, I mean, it's wild. You're not really doing classical literature. It's just a lot of people with a lot of stuff in their heads, and they're in charge now, and you have to listen to them, and they want you to write their essays. And frankly, and I won't mention the names of the books and stuff, but I'm like, this is, I can't believe after all the education I have, I wouldn't have called myself an A student, but I will say that I had a very good education. I'm like, this is like reliving junior high in France, where they make you read some of their pretty intense authors, which really, when you get down to it, just very dark. And I don't know if you know French movies. So their idea of a movie is if you can make it as dark as possible, where the hero dies in some, not in a heroic fashion, but in some despicable, then that's
so his head cut off with a guillotine.
Yeah. Yes. It's very dark. And of course, it's full of clever words and clever this and clever that. I get all that. I had already cycled through that in France. And then I'm like, okay, so now we get a different version with bitter professors just spewing, and you're forced to write essays, and all you're doing is trying to write an essay where you're hiding your contempt for at least how I felt about it. Your contempt for even the books that I would never pick up and read. And you read it and I get it. Okay, this person can put together very unusual, and they're trying to shock you with their thoughts. It's very it's just that mentality. And there's no way I'd ever pick up a book like that, ever recommend it, ever walk away with any positive insight into life. It's just, you know what, if you want that, just turn on some dark movie, dark channel. And so it seems like a lot of that university education is filled up with filler.
Waste of time, you mean?
Just waste of time. Waste of time. And it's, and people like to say, well, that one professor would change it. You know what? Again, movies. Same thing. Oh, we had these great conversations. You know what? The professors are so busy that you could barely talk to them. I mean, maybe you could get a hold of them to discuss a particular question on the examination coming up, but you're not really hanging out with the professors. You're not having deep conversations. That's all fantasy. I didn't know anybody who had that. I mean, you might have them with your fellow students if you were being careful to cultivate your relationships. But again, you're busy with side jobs or I have some friends that got caught up in the frat world. They had a good time. But as far as academics and learning, at the end of the day, it was a very small amount. I mean, I did learn. But when you look at the sum total of your work, you're just like, it's the 80-20 rule. 80% of it was trash. If it had not existed, I might have been better for it. But at the time, you don't know what it is. What is that 20%?
Oh, this is
okay. I'm back.
Yeah, this is This tests us all the time.
No, you know what? I think it is when the browser has a different control for the than I do with Zoom, and so there's two levels of control that I
Ah,
once I disconnect, it wants to go to something else. So
mm,
my apologies on that.
no problem at all. Anyway, I think we'll just finish up. So thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
So the main thing that this has done is that it's completely changed the educational methodology that we've used on our kids, that I have every intention of sharing with others. And so what we have done is from an early age is we have helped the children to take control of their educational path with our guidance in order for it to serve them. And that may sound like that's what people do,
Mm,
but that is not what people do. What you normally do is you have, especially in your teens, you have an educational bucket list, as people call that you try to
yeah.
fill up. And then eventually you try to find some approved formal educational path that allows you to do some customization of it. Well, we took a
Mm,
completely different approach. We decided to look instead at some of the natural inclinations and abilities and started building their education around that. And especially with an idea of being able to use it for the marketplace. So a lot of times people have their interests split. These are my interests, but they're
mm,
disconnected to bringing value to other people. So what happens is at some point they have to abandon it entirely, go through a crisis, or they pursue an education that does not quite make sense to their overall aspirations. And so at an early age, we came up with a method that will work with any type of personality. And I had the luxury, of course, as a homeschooling father in California, because California, surprisingly, is one of the freest states to be able to do whatever you want with homeschooling.
yeah.
Yeah, it's been like this for years. And I know some other states still struggle with some interference by the public schools. We don't have any of that.
Mm,
So I decided to really modify the educational path so that it's more in tune with each child, and where the child is actually taking more control with my
mm,
guidance. So they're not on their own, where they're trying to pivot constantly in order to develop a skill set that
mm.
integrates their natural abilities, but also with their environment. And we've been very successful at that. So I have 9 kids. 5 are out of the house already. They're young adults living on their own, pursuing careers that they really want to pursue and that they love. And that's because they started during their teens. And it's as simple as whenever they wrote an essay, rather than doing, for example, a traditional curriculum requirement where they may ask you to do a 3-paragraph essay or a
Yeah.
persuasive essay, we would turn that around and say, you can use that methodology of teach what they're teaching you, but it's got to be about your long-term interest. So everything was turned to basically creating a portfolio for what it is that they gradually discovered was their interest, rather than allowing the curriculum. And the curriculum was only a small part of it,
Mm,
dictating to them how much they would do in that area. So
yeah.
that's the overall. Um, Turning your interest into a marketable skill at an early age is amazing. You get this a lot in the adult literature, and a
Hmm.
lot of them would say at the end of the literature, if only I had started sooner. And so that put a bug in that. I started thinking, well, why not start sooner?
That's
And
it. So,
doing that transforms your children, because
mm.
I often have to go to the kids' room and turn off the light and say, okay, it's time to turn off the lights and get some sleep, because they're so on fire,
Yeah.
deep into what they're doing. It's so that their education and their schooling and their work and their desires to make a living are integrated very deeply. And because they have that time before they leave the house, a lot of people will come to that realization, oh shoot, had I come up with a way to, I've known friends that love to surf, right? So they want to live the surfing lifestyle, but they can't figure out a way to make a living. So it all comes crashing to an end. It's like, okay, I got to put my childhood away. So what happens if you figured out a way to actually make a living with your surfing interest? Wouldn't that be amazing? But you have to start early enough to have that room to experiment with a way to bring value to other people. I think that's really missing in people, where the sense of confidence, the sense of purpose, the sense of well-being comes actually from bringing value to other people, which then translates into making money off of it, at least to be able to support yourself with it.
Well, seems like you've cracked it then.
Yeah, it's difficult to get your mind around that, because most parents feel very, very naked trying to do something different than what everybody else is doing. So they panic. They will say, I will tell my children, the building up your marketable talent is as important as your official schoolwork. And so most parents will say, well, I don't want to force them into it. It's like, you're not forcing them into it. You're creating a space for them to be able to pursue it. Yeah. And I'll ask them, it's like, well, how do you feel about your child saying, hey, I don't want to do my English course this year, or I don't want to do my math course. You say, well, that's not a choice. They need to do that because I want them to have options. I guess that's the same thing. They don't see the long-term talent that their child could get into as being something valuable. They see that as something you accidentally fall into, but you don't treat the rest of your life like that. You don't even treat your regular schoolwork like that. You don't say, hey, little Johnny, oh, I guess you don't want to do your English lit class this year. You can skip out. You're just like, I don't care if you feel like it or not. I hope you like it, but I might help you, but you're still going to do it. I take that approach with my kids. I'll ask them, well, how much work did you put in today or this week in developing the talent that you love? And if they say, well, none, because I was playing video games, I'm like, video games have to come down. I want to see evidence that you have thrown yourself into the talent that you love in a way that brings value to other people, because as a parent, you can be that person to bridge that gap between children wanting the end result, but not understanding the work that needs to be done in order to get to that. And so as a parent, you can coach them along that way and open up that mindset that usually a traditional school education does not do, because you're waiting for the teacher to tell you, for the next 3 weeks, we're going to spend time on World War II. And then for the next week, we're going to spend a week on World War I. Well, why not the other way around? Why not 3 weeks on World War I and 1 week on World War II? There is no straightforward answer. The point is that there usually is an answer if you're thinking in terms of your child. So they're giving you the format 3 weeks on World War II, 1 week on World War I, because it fits their goals, whatever their goals are. Usually has to do with a group standard that they're trying to achieve. But is that achieving the goal that you want for your child? And at first, when you ask those questions, you're thinking there is no answer. That's not true. There is an answer once you reverse engineer what the goal is that you want with your child. So there always is an answer, but you have to wrestle with it a bit at first. And once you get it, it starts flowing.
Terrific. Anyway, I'm going to have to love you and leave you on this one. That's been fascinating.
All right. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Jonathan. That has been really, really enlightening. And good luck with it.
Thank you. God bless you.
The Tim Heale Podcasts. Ordinary people's extraordinary stories.